Welcome back to CEEN Caribbean News. It's now time for In Depth. December 5 is fast approaching, and delegates of the United National Congress in Trinidad and Tobago have been given another candidate to consider for the leader of the party. After weeks of speculation, former Senator Vasant Bharath has finally announced his bid for the UNC top post. But being a former key player in the camp of incumbent leader Kamla Prasad Visesa, what difference does he have to offer? We find out now as we've been joined by the man of the hour, Mr. Vasant Bharath. Welcome to In Depth, Mr. Bharath. Now, it took some time to materialize, so obviously much thought would have gone into your decision. So what fueled the choice to challenge Mrs. Prasad Visesa for the party's leadership?
Well, essentially, there were a lot of calls from across the country for me to get involved. I think the fact that the UNC lost a lot of goodwill that was given to it by the population in 2010, having won 29 of the 41 seats, and then having lost 11 of those seats in the last general election, created some sort of a crisis and a panic amongst the membership of the party. So much so that having lost 5 elections in the 5 years, and I say those would have been like the local elections, the Tobago elections, and then a couple of by-elections, many of the population felt that Mrs. Visesa may have become unelectable, and therefore we needed to revamp the party and reorganize it and really just re-energize the membership of the party so that we could move towards the local government elections next year and then, of course, the general elections in 5 or fewer years.
Now, you were considered a key member of Mrs. Prasad Visesa's government and her opposition team. Do you think that fact will negatively affect your bid for the party's leadership?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I was in charge of several different portfolios in the last government. In fact, I was the only government minister that was holding on to more than one portfolio. I was actually holding on to 3 portfolios, which would have been Minister of Trade, Industry and Investment, Minister of Communications, and also Minister in the Ministry of Finance. So clearly I was central to the government's development plans and programs. But the government is, and the work of the government is completely and totally different from the role of the party. And I think what has broken down are the party organs and institutions. The government rightly will go down in history as the best performing government the country has seen in the last 50 years in terms of the amount of development that's taken place countrywide, whether it's building more health facilities and hospitals, providing more water, building more schools. I think it's generally accepted that the government has outperformed any other previous government. The major issue has been the fall down of the party and the party's institutions, such that the members of the party did not have a say in what was happening. They didn't have a say with regard to the candidates that were chosen for elections, whether they were local elections or general elections, and there was a general disconnect between the party and the leadership of the party. Many ministers, in fact, were continually referred to as being high-handed and arrogant, and had distanced themselves completely from the base of the party. And hence, my slate and my team is called UNC Reconnect. In other words, reconnecting with the membership of the party.
Now, since the leadership race began, we've been seeing several questions arise about Mrs. Prasad Visesa's stewardship of the party. Are those questions likely to be used in your campaign?
Well, I think they're central to the campaign, but it's not just Mrs. Visesa's role. Remember that the party would have been run by a national executive, and that national executive would have had a leadership council, including the leader and 2 deputy political leaders. One of those deputy political leaders is Dr. Roodal Moonilal, who is also offering himself for political leader in these internal elections. So I think if responsibility is to be laid, it will not just be at the feet of the political leader, but at the feet of the deputy political leaders as well. And one of them, as I said, is Dr. Moonilal, who is offering himself as a potential political leader of the party.
So does this mean then that you're not concerned about Dr. Roodal Moonilal's challenge?
I'm not overly concerned, quite frankly. Dr. Moonilal doesn't really have the experience to rebuild or to rebrand the organization. His background has been, yes, he's been with the party for quite some time, but I'm not overly concerned with the challenge of Dr. Moonilal, although I will say that Mrs. Bissessa does have some residual emotional and sentimental support from the base, because, of course, having been a political leader and prime minister for a 5-year period, there is a certain amount of sentimentality attached to her candidacy.
Now, what are your plans for the UNC?
The very first plan of action, Candice, is to go to all of the 41 constituencies in Trinidad and Tobago and listen to the people. One of the things that people have not had the opportunity to do in the last 5 years is really to express their concerns that they would have had. So they've not been able to be critical of the organs of the organization. They've not been able to really be engaged through the organs of the party. So there's a lot of anger pent up on the ground. There's a lot of goodwill that's been lost, as I said, and people are bewildered as to why and how we could have lost as much of the goodwill as we had in 2010. So first port of call and major policy would be to go out to all of the 41 constituencies and start that rebuilding exercise, start talking to people. I fully understand that I may have some harsh words directed at me, but I'm not concerned about that because I know that once we go beyond that, we will get some genuine constructive criticism with which to build the organization.
Now, at least one political analyst has said that you'd be the preferred candidate to lead the UNC. Are you getting the support that you'd need to be effective in your campaign?
Well, Candice, as you would appreciate, this election is not going to be, it's not one where the general population votes. It's specific to the membership of the party. And that membership list is subject to a little contention at the moment in terms of who will be allowed to vote and who will not be allowed to vote. One of the things that analysts have been saying is that, look, if the UNC intends to win a general election, then the candidate that they choose for party leader has to be someone that crosses the political and racial divide, such that that person will attract people from outside of the traditional membership base to be able to confront the PNM and the current government, that is, and to get back into office in the shortest possible space of time. And many analysts are suggesting that I would stand a much better chance of being able to do that than Mrs. Bissessa and Dr. Moonilal at this point in time. But it really is a question of the strategy that we will use over the next 2.5 weeks to actually get the message across to the base, who you know, obviously, as I say, sometimes are very conservative and clearly sometimes very set in their ways, and therein lies the challenge.
Now, you've been quoted in regional media saying the UNC's internal elections on December 5 will be biased. Is that truly your view, or were you misrepresented?
I didn't say that it is going to be. What has been suggested by Mr. Pandey, former leader of the party and former prime minister, as well as another government minister of the past, Mr. Carlos John, former minister of works, is that there is a significant likelihood that the elections may be in some way manipulated because the election day machinery is in the control of the existing national executive and the existing political leader. Now, I'm not saying that is going to happen. I'm saying that we need to be vigilant because there are certain areas that we have concerns over, and particularly with the names of the people who are eligible to vote on the membership list. Now, I am filing my nomination papers tomorrow morning, and when I file, I expect to get a copy of the listing. Once we get a copy of the listing, then we're going to be in a position to determine whether names have been omitted or whether names have been added, and that kind of thing. So it'll be a bit premature for me to suggest anything other than I'm hopeful that there will be a free and fair election in Trinidad and Tobago on December the 5th.
Recently, the topic of who will be the opposition leader after the polls has come up. What happens in that regard if you take office?
Well, as you know, Candice, I'm outside of the Parliament at the moment. I've stated publicly that my focus and my energies will be devoted to rebuilding the organs of the party outside of the Parliament. The parliamentary agenda and the political leaders' agenda are two separate agendas, and so therefore Mrs. Bissessa currently is the leader of the opposition, and we've stated that we have no contentions with her staying on in that position. But of course, at the end of the day, that matter rests with the parliamentarians in the lower house, who has the option, of course, at any given time to change that arrangement.
The opposition currently has an election petition before the courts challenging the result of the recent general elections. If you take the reins of the party, will you be withdrawing that petition?
No, I will not be abandoning the petition simply because we are of the genuine belief that the EBC may not have had the authority to have altered the voting times. Now, the principle here, Candice, is this. We need to know what flexibilities and latitude the EBC has for future, because what we don't want to have is next year or next time round, the EBC suddenly at maybe 3 o'clock in the afternoon decides that there's been enough voting, and they suddenly say, well, okay, voting is closing off in an hour's time. When people go into an election day, they do so with full knowledge of what the parameters are in terms of the times, in terms of who is allowed to vote, and all the different rules and regulations that relate to voting on that particular day. When those arrangements are changed on an ad hoc basis, we've got to be concerned because it sets a precedent for future elections. And so therefore, we need to know from a court's perspective whether in fact the EBC would have had the authority to have altered the voting arrangements by an hour.
Thanks very much for joining us, Mr. Bharath. We were just joined by Vasant Bharath, former opposition senator in Trinidad and Tobago and one of the candidates challenging CableVision Optimum for the leadership of the United National Congress.